I guess I think all of us here have wondered whether or not you were going to predict whether there will be fewer zoos in the future or greater numbers of zoos in the future. When I first posed this symposium, I had about 10 or so zoo directors immediately say, oh, there's going to be fewer and they'll be larger. And I had another 10 almost immediately say, no, there'll be greater numbers and they'll be smaller. In fact, even in the audience during the break, the topic came up, are there going to be small zoos? Don Moore.
Well, can we define zoos? So for me, a zoo is an accredited zoo. There are 2,500 or so USDA licensed exhibit facilities. 250. 2,500 USDA licensed.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and thanks. And about 250 accredited zoos, which means 1/10 of those zoos in the United States meet the high bar of accreditation. I am hoping that most of the other 2,250, where's my math there? 2,250 go extinct, or most of those. Now, for instance, Watertown Zoo in New York is not an accredited zoo right now. It's a very fine little regional zoo, and I hope that they don't go extinct. So there's one exception, and I'm sure there are other exceptions in states around the country, but maybe 50 or so exceptions. But over 2,000 of those should go extinct. So decrease. And the other ones are going to get larger.
John Coe.
So far, the talk has really been all about North America, with a few exceptions. And take the numbers you just gave, and let's look at them globally. I don't know how many thousands of places there are around the world that call themselves zoos. Virtually none of them are accredited. And so if you look at, how do you measure the impact of zoos? Do you measure it by the highest achievements of 5 elite zoos in the world? Or do you measure it by the total impact on the environment and society of the thousands of good, bad, and ugly zoos all over the world?
Donna Fernandez.
There's also the issue of access in that, when the Buffalo Zoo was built 135 years ago, it thought it was out in the middle of nowhere. It was so far from the center of town in a highly agricultural area, then it turned into a park. Now it's completely landlocked. So, no matter where you design, to think that unless you're really restricting any settlement anywhere near there, there will be an idea of, is that place also landlocked? And where will the people live that are going to these zoos? And if we are going to be moving into highly urban areas, but our big zoos are 5 hours away and financially inaccessible to large numbers of people, that may not be the best way to educate the vast majority of our population moving forward.
So I take that as an endorsement of the
the persistence of
smaller,
an urban zoo.
Smaller urban zoos. Anybody want to take
Yeah,
a
I just have an anecdotal answer to you, and that was the last couple of years during the recession, Informal Science Review listed dozens and dozens of closings of museums, history museums, natural history museums, art museums. It just listed them. So it wasn't comprehensive, but there were lots and lots and lots of them. I can only think of one zoo that closed, and it's since been reopened. So if you look across this cultural landscape, I'm not aware of any zoos that closed down during this recession. I'm aware of probably hundreds of museums that did. So if we want to compare that, I would just say we've just gone through this tough economic time. That sort of touches on the tough economic nature of zoos and handing in there. So that's one anecdotal approach to that question. I don't see zoos disappearing.
But do you posit a dark age? Because if we were looking at a situation, well, there are people who have expertise in this. During the Depression, how did zoos do? I mean,
They did really
Yeah.
They did really well. Yeah, very well. Yeah, the WPA put tons of money into them, and so they actually dramatically expanded, and the number of visitors increased dramatically too, because in bad economic times it was something that you could go and do. And so families would go and do that as opposed to going on some kind of different vacation.
I had posed a thought experiment that we all try to design and build a zoo from scratch and put it 100 years in the future. When you did that in your minds, was it a large institution or a small one? The question Jeff tied it in with the topic of conservation, and we are going to try to address the role of zoos in conservation this afternoon. But with or without that in the mix, when you designed it in your mind, was it a small zoo or a large zoo?
Yeah, I had a big one with a bunch of small ones in it.
Both. The answer to my question is both.
I don't want to give away too much from what I'm going to say tomorrow, but my idea is a decentralized zoo. A central campus, probably smaller than a typical urban zoo today, and a dispersal of the zoo all around a large urban area. Because I think that, I'll explain tomorrow, but I think that one of the major issues is you have to get people to a zoo and you have to lower the price. And in some ways, the most convenient zoo for people who have small children is one that you can get to within 10 minutes, not a 2-hour drive as the wonderful Detroit Zoo is from where we live. And so small dispersed zoos that will look very different. They will not be the same kinds of exhibits that we expect at today's zoos. There'll be things more like the Hellbender, I don't know what crate, the shipping crate, and it might be located in an elementary school rather than a place that we would typically find a zoo.
John
His
Coe.
answer was better than mine.
Yeah, I noticed, by the way, the answer was, I'm changing the question.
Yeah.
It's great. John Coe.
Yeah, in my 100-year vision in the Dark Ages, the Dark Ages actually look a lot more like Arcadian Claude Lorraine paintings. And,
Wow.
and we're all living in rural, semi-rural, small communities, and we all have access to nature all around us. And basically, that's our zoo. The Hellbenders are in our frog pond, or the stream that flows past the frog pond. Wildlife has become semi-tame, just as we have, and we basically share the world.
Susan Margulis.
Yeah, I think a lot of what we've heard has to do not so much with are they going to be bigger or smaller, but are they going to be more different from one another? Are they going to be right size? And I think getting back to sort of the visitor component, we have to find a way to convince people that they can have a wonderful zoo experience even if they're not seeing the big charismatic megafauna that they're used to seeing. So I think that's a challenge that we have to face in educating our visitors, because without the visitors, we have no zoos.
Ron Kagan.
Yeah, and I think, David ran a zoo like that, the Arizona Desert Sonora Museum, which was much more tied into the local ecology and therefore didn't require all sorts of contortions and compromises that were fundamental. I think the question is very important, but I would just suggest that the answer is not just in terms of size or even in numbers. I think the answer to this is what are zoos doing? How are they operating? And just to sort of start thinking about that, I'm going to talk a little bit later today about what's happened in healthcare. And it isn't so much about physically changing what a hospital looks like, how big it is, how many there are. It's about what happens inside that hospital and fundamental changes. And that leads to a very different outcome in terms of care. So I think we have to make sure we're not stuck on a physical notion of the future.
Okay, John Coe actually touched on a topic that is related to a question posed by somebody from the audience, so let me pose it now. An audience member asked whether or not zoos are in the process of producing semi-domestic versions of their wild counterparts. I think we may be touching on some of these issues in the future. I know that's part of Monica's topic. But do we, actually, Monica, do you recommend that we wait until we get to that topic, or?
Yeah, maybe instead of discussing this, I would like to add to the
Yes, please.
question of size. I think I know two role models that don't even think they could be role models. One is a small native wild animal park in Germany that has free access, just native animals, huge playground, a lot of programs for children to play with natural materials, domestic animals to touch, things like that, easily accessible, great nature experience, very educational. Still, they don't even consider themselves as a zoo, but I think that would be a model for a future urban zoo. And the other one is also a wild animal park outside of cities, just native animals, a lot of research, a lot of free-range animals. And that could be a model for a part of for managing meta-populations of wild animals, of wild native animals, as visitor attractions.
There is, in fact, a similar park, I don't know if you've seen it in Newfoundland, that it has only native wildlife and also it puts the visitor through an experience of a walk through the forest. Jeff?
I did touch on the sort of the zoo animals thing, but let me come back to it quickly. The whole reason for 90% genetic variability is so that you can do reintroductions, and we know that is good for certain species. They're not zoo animals. I mean, frogs can go back after multiple generations in human care. So it's taxa dependent. That said, when you start talking about animals that really have to learn to survive in the wild, and the example of lemurs was one of them, you're probably in the long-term future, at least if we still have the kind of technological development that we have now along a smooth curve, I think what we're really talking about is the transfer of gametes. So you're not trying to move the animal back into the wild, you're trying to move the sex cells back into the wild, and there's a fundamental difference there.